Hey guys, it's Madison. Today's video is all about current horror trends and trends that I predict will take off in 2021. Considering the year we just had, I should probably clarify that I mean horror trends in fiction, not real life. I am not pitching 2021 prophecies over here. When I was teaching my horror writing class in October, I mentioned how since there's been an increase in diversity in film and literature in the past few years, and how we've seen an increase in folk horror films such as Midsummer and Hereditary, that soon we're going to start seeing folk horror movies from cultures other than European cultures. And sure enough, a week later, Netflix premiered His House, which is an amazing folk horror film. I highly recommend it. And around the same time, Spell came out, which is another folk horror film that revolves around the concept of hoodoo, and it kind of added its own spin to the folk horror genre. So I believe that we're going to continue to see more folk horror films from cultures other than European cultures, and I'm really excited to see more films like this. And now for a really obvious one. We are going to see a ton of pandemic stories next year. We've already started to see this with the movie Songbird, which is basically 2020, the movie. Also The Stand, which is just a weird, freaky coincidence that no one foresaw. I don't think anybody could have known how relevant The Stand was going to be this year. I've also noticed this trend in novels as well, such as Paul Tremblay's novel Survivor's Song. Pandemic novels have been taking off this year as well. And I think that we're going to continue to see this trend well into 2021, and maybe even a few years beyond. So even though I think that pandemic stories are going to be really popular next year, I also think that the market is going to quickly oversaturate with pandemic stories and pandemic movies. So if you are currently working on a pandemic novel right now, I would seriously consider self-publishing, because even if you got accepted today, it typically takes 12 to 18 months to traditionally publish a novel, and by then the market is going to be oversaturated. So if you're currently working on a pandemic novel, I would definitely consider self-publishing. Also, I think there's going to be at least a few pandemic-related anthologies next year. I've already started talking to some people about it, and I know that there's definitely an interest in having a pandemic-related anthology, so I definitely think there's going to be a few of them next year. So if you have an idea for a pandemic-related story that you think could be a good short story, I would consider working on it sooner rather than later. I also think post-pandemic horror stories could be really popular as well. Perhaps you write a story where the pandemic is over, but then something else really horrible happens. Like perhaps due to the pandemic, there is a shortage of emergency workers, so that whenever aliens invade, we're more vulnerable than ever before. Or perhaps you could write a story where the pandemic took out most of the citizens in this small town, including law enforcement, so you have the ability to write this really interesting Western horror story. I definitely think that post-pandemic stories that carry this underlying hope that the pandemic will soon be over could be really popular if written well. Another trend I see continuing is horror comedy. Horror comedy, especially stories that really lean heavily on the comedy, have been on the rise in the last few years. Maybe it's due to political unrest or just general discontent with the way that the world is going, but people really need a laugh right now, even in their horror stories. I also think that the popularity of Happy Death Day could be why this subgenre is on the rise as well. I've noticed that other films, such as Freaky, have a very similar feel to Happy Death Day, and I've also noticed that my own horror comedy stories are being snapped up almost immediately, so I definitely think that this trend is going to continue into 2021. Also, horror satire and political commentary. The new Purge movie is coming out this year. That's definitely going to have a lot of political commentary in it. And then we recently had The Hunt, which is basically a commentary on political tension in America. I don't see that tension resolving anytime soon, so I definitely think that this trend is going to continue into 2021. Also, I think that we're going to continue to see a lot of stories that revolve around racism and classism, along the lines of Get Out and Ready or Not. Although I haven't seen a lot of horror movies set in space lately, I have seen a lot of anthology submission calls looking for space horror stories. I've also seen a lot of submission calls looking for survivalist horror stories, and I've seen a lot of movies with survivalist horror themes, such as the movie Sweetheart, which is basically Castaway with a monster, but it's a really good movie. If you don't know what survivalist horror is, I would subscribe to this channel because I'm going to be doing a whole video on it soon. Now I'm going to discuss horror trends that I think are out. First off, zombie horror. While I think that there will continue to be good zombie stories here and there, I do think that the overall demand for zombie content is already declining and is going to be pretty much deader than dead soon. The Walking Dead is on its final season, and the popularity of the zombie trend has been intrinsically linked to The Walking Dead since the start of the show. with the show's rise in popularity corresponding with the rise in the popularity of zombies, and then also declining at the same rate. I don't know if zombie fatigue is what caused people to lose interest in The Walking Dead, or if people losing interest in The Walking Dead is what kind of killed off the zombie trend, but either way, I think the end of the show is going to mark the end of mainstream zombie content for a while. Earlier this year, I predicted that we would continue to see a decline in vampire stories. Now I don't know. I think that the continued popularity of superhero and supervillain films is going to make Morbius really successful next year, and if it is, we might see a slight increase in vampire horror stories. I definitely think that if it's successful, that we're going to continue to see supervillain horror stories along the lines of Brightburn, which I'm really excited about. I could really get behind that trend. I feel like people aren't going to be that into post-apocalyptic stories next year, unless it's a commentary on the experiences that we've collectively shared in 2020, like a parody about the toilet paper shortage or a serious story about people fighting over resources. Post-apocalyptic horror stories have oversaturated the market just as much as zombie stories, so I definitely think that we're going to continue to see a decline in popularity compared to how popular it was a few years ago. What 2021 horror trends do you think we'll see? Please leave a comment below with your horror predictions. If you liked this video, please hit that like button and subscribe. I would appreciate it so much. Thanks for watching. Have a happy new year, and I'll see you in 2021.